All right, guys, welcome to the 21st Century Physio podcast. We've got a massive episode here today. We've got the Kettlebell Physio, Meigh, a guy who I first met probably 4 years ago, one of my first mat courses. The first time that I saw him, he was actually 10 metres tall. You know, it's unbelievable. I walked in through the centre that we were running the course at, and there he is, his big face up on the outside of the building. So it was a really good way to meet him, and he made an impression on me that day. I knew that he had some special things to bring to the industry, and I think you'll be pretty amazed with some of the stuff that he's done in career and he's got going forward. So thanks for joining us today, Neil.
Hi, Stephen. Thanks for that welcome. It's my pleasure.
Is it still up? I've got to ask first before we get started.
It is. Funnily enough, my professor sent me a text photo of that only a few weeks ago. He was up in Brisbane, randomly walking down that road and saw me.
Yeah.
A little embarrassing, but yeah.
You can't miss you. You can see you from suburbs away. So
it's huge.
Now, Neil, so obviously for the listeners who haven't come across your work before, you're quite prominent on social media, but do you want to give them a bit of a rundown about yourself?
Oh, where would you like me to start? With my physio?
Yeah, let's start with your physio journey, I guess.
I went into physio as a mature student, so I know when a lot of other people have been asked about physio, they've usually had a sporting background and experience being with a physio and them helping, and that wasn't my experience at all. I had a career change when I moved here to Australia in 2004. And ended up training as a personal trainer then. So I was 30 then, and then moved into manual therapy, where I spent several years. And it was the transition into manual therapy and the interest in anatomy and that area that motivated me to go on to uni. So I came to Bond in end of 2007, went through exercise science and then the physiotherapy program here, graduated 2012. That's my brief physiotherapy journey.
And so when you go back and you look where you started as a personal trainer, you went through some, I guess, more massage, myotherapy-based stuff before the physio. What do you think that added to your physiotherapy, or what do you think? Would you recommend other people, go through that process?
Oh, there's lots of questions there. I think it's invaluable having that personal training background for lots of different reasons. Exercise fundamentally, and I started training when I was in gyms when I was 16, so it would have been 91. And I'd always been involved with sport. My dad was heavily involved in sport, and that it was just a part of my life. And fundamentally, I think that's continued to be my driver and what's motivated me. So it was a natural. I had a big life event in 2004 and changed careers completely different. My last job was at the BP refinery in Brisbane. Wow. As a project manager and business analyst there, so completely different. Went into sales very briefly, didn't like that, and then personal training, and that was the exposure to anatomy and movement and exercise, which I was comfortable with and familiar with. So I think in that respect, the personal training is invaluable because there's this perception that when you go through exercise science, you're coming out as a personal trainer, and that's not necessarily the case. And then because that's often a prerequisite to going on to physio, they presume that you've already done all of that exercise, but that might not have been the case. And then you don't do it again through physiotherapy. So I think those that have that personal training background and the experience in and around exercise and working with people that are doing exercise, I think are an advantage when they go out into physiotherapy private practice. And I think the same could be said for manual therapy as well. We used to train a certificate for and a diploma of remedial massage, and some of the students that I had trained there came through Bond, and two of them were actually my classmates. And wow. You notice a difference in not so much manual handling, but their comfort with people, their comfort hands-on with people, and building that therapeutic relationship, if you want to call it, through touch, I think was noticeably easier for them to transition to because they'd had that background. So there's definite advantages to having had that.
Yeah, and I think that's a similar journey that I found as well, going through a similar process. I guess while we're on the topic of manual therapy, it's quite controversial. There's different there's 2 or 3 different camps out there at the minute. The side that says don't do any manual therapy. You see a patient once, going your way to the other guys who are, doing the traditional stuff that we learned through physiotherapy. Given that you've had a background working in that type of industry, teaching, manual therapy, and being, a physiotherapist, how do you find that? Where's the balance there? What are your thoughts?
Oh, another interesting question. And that's been a really challenging journey for me, because that's where I started. That's what I was taught. That's what I was teaching. And that's the only framework at that point that I had. That was my reference. People came in, we took them through a general musculoskeletal screen, as it was called. And it was based on an osteopathic framework. So we used Greenman's principles of modern manual medicine. And we, quote unquote, diagnosed based on movement disorders and dysfunctions, and we treated like that. And I didn't know any different then. Fast forward several years, you know differently, and I definitely moved away from that. And I found it very difficult to practice as a physiotherapist, but be perceived as either a manual therapist or a massage therapist. It's like I've done that. That was my training and my experience and my qualifications. I've moved on and I've done something different, and I don't want to continue doing the same thing. I don't feel there's a need to do that, and I wanted to be perceived differently. So when I opened up my practice, I made a conscious decision to employ massage therapists and employ myotherapists, so that I was perceived differently by the people that were coming through the door. So I made a personal choice to distance myself from manual therapy. That wasn't to say that I didn't use it, but that was the perception that I wanted to give.
And was that a personal thing based on your understanding of the research, or that you felt that your skill set had evolved and moved past that, or was it just purely an enjoyment factor for you?
The research. I went through something called the Skills Finder profile in 2006, and learner came out as top. So I'm intrinsically motivated by the process of learning. It's not being driven to be right, but driven not to be wrong. And I've spent, I think, since 2005, it's just been one thing after another in terms of qualifications and learning. And I feel like I've learned so much more than what I had back then in 2006, 7, and 8. And I can't do the same things with the same beliefs and rationale. And I can't justify that. I think one way that I put myself under pressure is that I almost imagine that someone like Greg Lehman's sitting in the corner of the room and watching what I'm doing. And if I can justify what I'm doing to someone like Greg, who I would view as a peer, then I feel comfortable. And if I can't, then I won't do it. So that's, I guess, the line that I've taken. Even this morning, just before this chat, I noticed one of Greg's posts from yesterday about the kinesiopathological model of care and treatment. So yeah, it's been a difficult journey shifting away from that and having a different understanding of what's actually happening and why I might be doing something, and the potential for me to make change and what that change might actually be or not. So yeah, it's been difficult.
And so with that understanding, do you think there's still a place for manual therapy in physiotherapy today?
I guess that depends how you define manual therapy. Yeah, I want to stay on the fence with this one, to be honest. I think there's a place for manual handling and putting your hands on people and making them feel safe and comfortable, particularly where there's potentially pain or fear of movement, all of those beliefs. So I'm very much, I guess, in the Peter O'Sullivan camp of cognitive functional therapy, and the role that manual therapy, however you define that, plays within that framework. I have definitely moved away from the operator model of the treatment table or plinth being the centerpiece and somebody laying down on the table and me doing something to them with the intent or belief from their part that I'm fixing or changing something fundamentally about their body. So yes and no, there's a place, but how and why you might be doing something and the narrative behind it, I think, is really important.
Yeah, definitely, very much so. So you obviously went out with a purpose when you started Pride
Yep.
Physiotherapy, your physio practice, with a purpose to do something different, try and change the industry, with that thought process. How did you go about setting up that practice around that?
To answer the question, yes, there was definitely a purpose, and one of our business bylines was doing things differently or changing the face of physiotherapy. We had two, and I guess to step back a little bit, I'd graduated, I'd gone into private practice, so working for somebody else, and it was a job that I'd had lined up for 4 years, and it clinically it didn't go the way that I wanted, and I'd moved away from that within 4 months. Ended up going back to the teaching role that I'd had, and was given an opportunity to develop the myotherapy course here in Queensland. And when I started, I didn't realise or appreciate that the development of that course formed the business model for Pride Physiotherapy. So what we were teaching and delivering, the ethos and the ethics behind it, the way that we were pitching manual therapy to the myotherapy students, that turned into Pride was a working model of the myotherapy program at Q Academy here. So unbeknownst to me at the time, I'd spent 2 years building this model. And then I'd spent 12 months on the business plan preparing for this and wanting to do things differently, having a holistic approach to health, hence why it was called Pride Physiotherapy and Nutrition. We wanted to be very exercise focused and get people in and develop more of a community and get people engaged around activity and education, and kettlebells just happened to be that tool. And it just didn't turn out the way that we planned, and then that goes off on a different path. So,
Well, take us down that path. So what did you learn along the way?
I guess everything.
Because I find this story, yeah, I find this story, really, really intriguing. I loved reading your post. For the people, the listeners who don't know, so Pride's obviously finished now. You're now doing a PhD, so you've moved on to bigger and better things. But I think the thing that I really admired from you is, reading the post that you put up after, it closed down, and then some of those learnings you had along the way. And I think there was some really insightful things for, physiotherapists all around the world to take from that.
Yeah. There was so many. Whether it was that was the first business that I'd run. I'd had a business and management degree. I finished that in '96, and I've been fortunate to work with some pretty savvy business people. So I didn't feel like I went into it ignorant to how the world worked. We spent a lot of time preparing the business plan. We picked the site very strategically based on the population here on the Gold Coast and the location in Southport, and just nothing went to plan. I jumped in with both feet. I was absolutely convinced that the model that we wanted to implement, that we believed wholeheartedly would work, without a shadow of a doubt was going to work. So we had a best case and a worst case business plan. Even right from the outset, it was quite an upmarket area, and the owners of the premise required us to engage a designer and an architect. So we spent 10 grand just on the architect because that was a requirement. And it's a lot of money that we hadn't planned at the outset before the doors had even opened. And it felt like a lot of those things. The people that we expected to come through the doors never came, whether it was referrals from GPs, people coming out of hospital post-surgery, the expectations of the service that we were providing, either from the people walking through the doors, the GPs that may or may not have been referring to us, just everything didn't go to plan. I'd gone into it, we'd bet everything on that. So we'd put the house on the line, taken out a bank loan, and signed a lease for 3 years. So I was in it for the long haul. And up until I think June 2017, I was committed to doing that regardless of the outcome. And it was, the writing was on the wall pretty soon on that the model that we were wanting to run, that was predominantly around exercise and revenue largely coming from group classes, wasn't going to work, and we changed back to a more traditional model of physiotherapy. But we just couldn't get foot traffic through. So every week from day dot, we were trying different things. I'll give you a good example. There were, I think, 54 GPs and 6 local hip and knee surgeons. So with the GPs, I'd approached them and said, look, if you've got patients that fit into any one of these 4 categories, I think it was non-specific low back pain, osteoarthritis, obesity, and I can't remember what the 4th one was. We said, if you've got a patient on your books, we will take them on for 2 months at no cost, because we thought that was going to be the best way that we could demonstrate that we could deliver a good service, a good quality service. And of those 50 plus GPs, we had one GP refer a couple who didn't turn up. I think they turned up for the initial appointment, and then they just didn't turn up. So we thought, that's not going to help you or us. And then one young girl that had depression and anxiety, and that was it from 50 odd GPs. So we couldn't give our services away. Same story with the surgeons. I even tried to get one local surgeon who's operated on me twice engaged in a bit of a clinical trial with people that had arthritic knees that weren't suitable candidates for surgery. And I'd pitched this idea about kettlebells because I knew that there was some data that demonstrated a doubling of body weight through the knees with a kettlebell exercise with no impact and limited range. And I thought, that makes sense. We'll take somebody on and we'll do the same thing. And again, we just couldn't get people through the door. So ultimately, the model wasn't financially viable. We'd picked an expensive area, the rent was high, and it got to a point where we'd dug ourselves into such a big financial hole that we had to just pull the plug and walk away. So I did.
And this is a pretty common story, I think. A lot of people start practices and don't realise the overheads involved with those, I guess. Especially some of those unexpected costs, which I think you mentioned with the architect and stuff. There's always those other little things. Were there any other sort of, apart from obviously trying to get those people in through the door, was there any other things you learned along the way, through that journey?
Have you got a particular topic in mind?
Like, if you're talking about, you went more towards a membership-based model, why do you think that didn't necessarily work as well?
I think that's perception. I didn't want my experience of people being referred from the GP in Australia, the extended primary care plans was not a positive one, and I actively didn't want for that to be our predominant market. So it wasn't until toward the end that I started approaching the GPs, and that was a real eye opener. My wife's a GP, so I should have had some input on that. But I remember having a meeting would have been 8 or 9 GPs at a large local practice, and I was astounded that they didn't associate me with exercise. So any of their patients that they felt would benefit from some form of physical, active, exercise-based intervention, they were sending to an exercise physiologist down the road. So we would have never have seen them. And I created a recent meme on this. I remember one of the GPs asking me if I did any advanced stuff like dry needling. So that was my experience of the GP's expectation. Because the practice was set up, so we had, you came through the doors, there's a small reception area, 3 treatment rooms, and then 80 square meters of open plan gym floor space. We didn't have a lot of equipment because kettlebells was the thing. So we had a lot of kettlebells there, and then a large rack at the back. We had no barbells and bumper plates because there just wasn't space for it, but we used the rack for different things. But when people walked through the door, they saw this and it didn't look like a physiotherapy practice. It didn't look like the norm. And we would often get asked, is this a CrossFit box? Do you do CrossFit here? Or they would see the rowers standing up in the corner and ask about Pilates. And people would come in and they would look confused because it didn't fit their expectation of what a physio was, despite the fact that it said physiotherapist out the front. And we were very close to a 24-hour gym. Their personal trainers are busy. And I thought, you know what, I'm going to change tact here, and I'm going to make it a lot more obvious that we want to engage people in physical activity. So I'm going to use the personal training avenue. So had this large 2.5 meter square banner plastered on the front wall outside that said personal training with a physiotherapist. The perception being that if people wanted personal training, then there would be more value in having that with somebody that was also a personal trainer, and that just didn't fit either. So we didn't get people coming in wanting personal training because they'll go to a personal trainer for that. So I felt like we were getting crippled in all directions. I'd picked a tool that was unfamiliar with people, so they didn't know what kettlebells were, or if they did, they had no real interest in them. So there wasn't a market of people wanting to engage in the style of exercise. We'd had people coming in wanting to do Pilates, and we'd have to send them off down the road because that's where the reformers were. So I'd taken a risk, and it hadn't paid off in lots of different ways. I think the big take from that, people have often asked, would I do it again? And the answer would be yes, if it wasn't dependent on me having to make money to pay the bills. So I often used to stand in the practice and feel really proud of what we had created and what we wanted to achieve and the way that we were doing. I felt really proud with that. So it was disappointing that it hadn't worked, and I would definitely do it again. And I'd like to do it again. I hope that at some point after the PhD, I'm able to do something similar, because my interest has always been population health and behavior change around non-communicable diseases. So I hope that I can do something like that, but our fixed overheads were 10 grand a month. And if there's going to be that financial pressure, then I wouldn't do it. So my advice to people would be to, if you're going to go into it, do something where your overheads are minimal to start with, and then build up from there.
I think that's pretty sound advice there. You brought up an interesting point, I guess, that, GPs didn't associate physiotherapy with exercise.
Yep.
Do you see that being a big problem going forward for, physios coming out who are being taught more, an exercise-based approach?
I think that is a challenge. I used to have conversations with my wife about the business, because she was a co-director but not actively involved on a day-to-day basis, and she never really understood why I was doing what I was doing. It was like the concept was confusing to her, and that's my wife, a kettlebell instructor and a partner in the business. So that should have been a flag. I think here in Australia it's really challenging with the accredited exercise physiologists, because they're naturally now the go-to. Professor Greg Gass, that set up the program here at Bond, had this vision of exercise physiologists or exercise scientists, as we were when we went through the program, going on and doing the postgraduate physio, becoming this ultimate physiotherapist that was the go-to for exercise prescription, and that hasn't materialized here. That's not the emphasis of the course at all, and I think we've lost that market share of exercise, and I don't think we are viewed by the general public as the go-to person for exercise. I think it's very much still manual therapy.
So what do you think the future of education's heading for physiotherapy, given that you're obviously heavily involved up there at Bond and doing your PhD, doing some teaching? What changes are we going to see over the next 10, 15 years?
There's always change. I don't know where it's going to go. And my only experience, obviously, here is at Bond. I do ask what's happening elsewhere. This year, for example, up until literally this semester with the current first year students, it's the first time that a contemporary understanding of pain science has started to become integrated into what's being delivered in the classroom. And it's still a long, long way off where I think other programs might have it. So we've definitely got a very long way to go, and it's really hard. I guess I spend a lot of time looking at what's happening on social media and what people are saying and doing. And I know Jack Chew's talked about this. You get stuck in this echo chamber, and you think that the whole is your perception of it, and I don't think that's the case at all. I hope the programs will change quicker than they probably will. I'd like to see more of a shift toward, as Sandy Hilton said, having pain be the air that you breathe, and an contemporary understanding of pain and pain science and how that influences the interactions that you have with people, whether it's in a hospital setting or an outpatient private practice setting. And pain being at the forefront and everything else fitting around it, and us being defined by how we think, not what we do. But I think that's realistically probably a long way off.
Yeah, look, it definitely is moving. I know when I went through the UniSA program, they had the Noi group, Dave and Lauren were there teaching the cutting edge pain stuff. But I guess that integration was the thing that, wasn't there, which that was a while ago now. Hopefully that's changed. But in the next room, you'd be going in, you'd be doing really specific, grade 2 PAVMs to try and, fix the facet joint, I guess. So there was a bit of a misunderstanding, a lack of integration between some of those, cutting edge thoughts that they're teaching and some of the application in practice.
And that's really challenging because you get students learning one thing and then they learn something else which completely contradicts it. And it's difficult. When you're a student, you want black and white because you want an answer and you want to understand things. And it creates such a conflict when people like me, as a pain in the ass, I'm in the tute rooms with a small group of students, and I'm feeding these papers and this information which conflicts with what they're being told elsewhere. And it's just, I understand that that's not helpful, but I don't feel comfortable not speaking up. Even last week, we're looking at upper cross syndrome. I've been asked to help out in a class with the sacroiliac joint in 10 days' time. It's difficult. It's a big, slow moving ship. Yeah. It's going to take a while to turn it around.
Yeah, no, definitely. I think there's some positive things coming forward. So I'm going to ask you, why kettlebells?
Good question. I was thinking about this when I first saw them, and it would have been, I don't think I had even seen a kettlebell prior to 2008, and I would have actively avoided them. And I know I actively avoided them like the plague until 2012. I attended a FMS course down in Melbourne at Andrew Reid's place at the end of 2012, and there were predominantly personal trainers there, and within the functional movement systems, the Gray Cook program, they use kettlebells within a lot of their corrective exercise prescription. And there were exercises being done there that the personal trainers were doing that they were comfortable with, that I was struggling with. I'd either never seen, or if I was trying them, they were just difficult to do. And that made me feel uncomfortable. That first time you've ever seen somebody lay down on a bench with 2 dumbbells and they're shaking and wobbly. I felt like a fish out of water with dumbbells with the kettlebells. And I heard the messages and it just struck a chord with me. And I thought, I like what I see. I don't understand this. I don't get it. I don't know how to do it. So I'm going to jump in with both feet and go through the training program, the RKC training program at that point. So I signed myself and my wife up. We trained for 8 months and then went through the RKC course in, I think, September, October 2013. Fantastic. And that's all I've done ever since. So since the beginning of 2013, I've moved away from the traditional barbell gym program, which I'd done from 91, and kettlebells is pretty much all I've done since, plus bodyweight exercise. And
some pretty big kettlebells at that, from some of those videos you share on social media. Yeah. It's pretty impressive. So when did you decide to go with the name, the Kettlebell Physio? You've obviously, as you said, gone full head in. When did you decide to create that brand?
That was very much a strategic marketing choice. People look at my surname and they don't know how to pronounce it. It's easier to remember the Kettlebell Physio than it is Neil Meigh. So, and the logo was fairly distinctive. So it was a very clear marketing decision to go with the Kettlebell Physio. That would have been 2014. I just decided on that. And we were already planning for Pride Physiotherapy at that point. So yeah, it was just planning ahead and marketing more than anything else, something that was easily identifiable. I jumped onto the kettlebell bandwagon at that point, and I just saw it being, I guess, fundamental to where I was heading. And I don't think I appreciated at that point where it might end up.
Well, doing a PhD now on kettlebells. Tell us a little bit more about that.
Yes. When I left uni in '96, I swore that I'd never go back again. I did a business and management degree, no interest in it at all. And then it was the anatomy and exercise that really got me interested. And I loved my time coming through exercise science and physio. I enjoyed the process of learning. But when I finished, a PhD was not even on the radar. I had so much downtime, funnily enough, at Pride, that I was spending my time learning and getting more familiar with what was being published and following people and watching and listening. And it was that made me think I'd actually quite like to be involved in research. Why the kettlebells is that there was nothing. I was promoting this idea of evidence-informed practice or evidence-based practice, and there was nothing. So here's me as a physio promoting evidence-based practice with no evidence to support my own practice using kettlebells. It was all theories, and that made me feel uncomfortable. When I made the decision to close the practice, the ball was already rolling. I had some ideas, and because I had come through this program here, I was in contact with the staff, so it was easy to engage them in the process of having a conversation and asking. But I didn't know what was involved with a PhD. I put my hand up and completely ignorant, and again got that wrong. So there's a lady that came through the practice. I used to run 2 workshops in the morning. So we had a kettlebell class, 2 in the morning, 2 in the afternoon, 6 days a week essentially. And our most regular visitor was 68. She had 2 prosthetic knees. She could swing a 40 kilo bell. She could row 24, 28. She was amazing. And anecdotally, she recanted 2 instances where she had been at home and tripped and avoided a fall, and had specifically come in and attributed avoiding the fall to her change in function through the program. So the initial idea was falls risk, looking at improving the lower limb strength and physical function and power of older adults to reduce falls risk. So that's where it started, and that's why older adults, and that's eventually where we'll end up hopefully later this year.
And what do you think kettlebells, make so much of a difference, or are so beneficial to that compared to some other training tools?
Good question, and contrary to popular belief, and I know I push this so much on the page, but it's very much tongue-in-cheek. The kettlebell is no better than anything else. There are some things that you can do with a kettlebell that you can't do with a dumbbell or a barbell, but vice versa. It's just a load. The reason why kettlebells I feel are a useful tool is that they're small, they're relatively cheap to buy, and they're quite easy to learn. There's a limited number of exercises that can produce quite a good practical outcome. So little Mrs. Smith that's 70 years old is not going to have a barbell and bumper plates in her house, but it's easy for that person to acquire a kettlebell and have it tucked away. The program that I'm going to be running, or the trial that I'm going to be running, is very pragmatic. So I'm going to be pushing people as hard as they're prepared to go, but we're only using a deadlift and a swing. I know Peter O'Sullivan's used this metaphor about brushing your teeth. If people come in and they're in pain, he asks them if they brush their teeth, and they say, yes, of course. And he says, well, why? And the response is, well, because it's good for my teeth and my gums. They do it because they know that it's healthy. So the idea is, if there's a simple exercise that somebody can do independently at home, that's safe, that is with a piece of equipment that's easy to use, it's cheap, it's portable, and they can integrate that into their life as they were brushing their teeth. So whether it's doing 10 deadlifts before they brush their teeth, or swings, or whatever it might be, if they can integrate that and get a noticeable, significant objective improvement in function that reduces their risk of falls, or whatever it might be, then for me that seems like a worthwhile intervention, because the stats on older adults and the potential negative consequences of aging are significant and costly. So it's just a tool. It's an easy tool. It's not that kettlebells are better than anything else, but they're quite cheap and convenient.
Yep, no, I think it's a great philosophy there. I think I like the analogy, like brushing your teeth. So the deadlift and the swing would be some of the earlier exercises. If there's some physios listening looking to get into kettlebells, they might start to look at with their patients and clients.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. I know with the hard style training program that I went through, there's 6 fundamentals, and you can use bits of those 6. So swing, clean, press, squat, snatch, and a get up. So that older lady with her 2 prosthetic knees, getting up and down off the floor was quite challenging for her, and it took her 12 months to be able to do a get up, and she managed to do that with a weight. For me, and I've presented about this, there's something called a floor transfer test in a geriatric population, and it's recommended for older adults because it's a safety issue. If somebody falls over and they're on the floor, they need to be able to get themselves back up again. And essentially the Turkish get up, if you dispense with the weight, is just a very structured way of getting from lying on the ground to standing back up again. It's a transfer from lying to sitting to kneeling, kneeling to standing, and that's it. So I think people see the Turkish get up and see people doing crazy things with it and think, how is that functional? Why is that useful? I'd never do that. But if you scale it right back to no weight, let's just transfer from getting off the floor to sitting up in a chair or standing upright and then going about your day, then it just takes on a different perspective. And the way that it's taught, and because it's structured, I feel it's a relatively useful objective measure in some instances, looking at joint range and function and capacity. Even somebody's ability to roll from laying on their back to propped up on the elbow, you can identify upper limb and shoulder girdle issues in some people where they just don't have the capacity to depress their shoulder sufficiently to support their body weight. And then there's this sequence of events that people go through, and if you know what normal is, it's obvious when something doesn't work the way that it typically does, and then it makes you think, why? And is that something that I need to take any notice of or not? And if it can be changed and improve somebody's function, then that might be something that I address. So for me, the get up turned into a bit of a physical movement assessment as well.
Fantastic. I think the movement is the test, and the test is the movement or the exercise, I guess. So Good philosophy there. Now, you mentioned you are uncomfortable, with not having the evidence there for what you're doing in your practice.
Yeah.
How do you advise people out there? Because this is a really common thing that I encounter. People almost get that paralysis by analysis. They sort of tend to overanalyze things, and then when they look, that answer for that specific thing just isn't there. What do you say to your students, when you're teaching?
That's another difficult question as well, because I feel the more I've learned, the more ignorant I've become. So the more you know, the more you don't know. And I feel like I've been in that situation where I've been almost paralyzed by being uncomfortable knowing that I don't have the answers. I know when I first went into private practice, I used to set myself up for failure, because every person that walked through the door, I felt like I needed to give them a diagnosis and have them walk out that door feeling better, quote unquote, fixed. And that just doesn't happen. Half the time you don't know exactly why, and they don't walk out feeling 100% better. So I was having to deal with the feelings of that. But I think there's a point where you almost come full circle. If you pay attention to what's being published and what people are talking about, you become a lot more comfortable with being uncomfortable and saying, I don't know. And that pressure of feeling like you need to be doing things correctly does lift, because there isn't necessarily a correct way of doing something. You could have 3 different practitioners in 3 different professions all working on the same person, and they might all get that person better or help them significantly. So that's definitely been a shift. I do feel quite uncomfortable from a knowledge point of view, because I feel like I want to know, and I know I'm very well aware that I don't. So that's been difficult. But what can you do other than stay current? I'd rather be current and uncomfortable than 10 years ago still doing what I was doing, or doing what I was doing 10 years ago, and ignorant.
And I get the impression that's a big reason, for the Kettlebell Physio and a lot of the social media stuff you do that helps you stay current and engage with people, thinking both similarly but also, very different as well.
Yeah. Well, when you say engage, I actively don't engage with people very much on Facebook in particular, because too often, and I've talked about this in the last couple of days in that podcast I posted about tribalism. Everyone's got an opinion, and I'm not posting that stuff to change people's opinion. I'm posting it because it's stuff that I'm interested in, that I think other people might be interested in. And if they like it, great. If not, great. I don't really care. What they do with it is entirely up to them. So it's almost like for me, it's almost been like a diary. I've posted things, and I've gone back many times to posts that I've subsequently forgotten about and thought, this is brilliant, this is really good, it's clinically useful and relevant, and pass that on to the students. So for me, when I came through physio in 10, 11, 12, social media as it exists now didn't exist then, and so much of what I've learned and the beliefs that I have now have come from people like yourself and people all around the world that are sitting in conferences, posting tweets, or they're sharing articles, or they're talking about something that's in print on a podcast, and it's overwhelming trying to stay current. That's probably the biggest challenge, is there's so much out there that you can't stay current even if you wanted to. So it's more just me sharing rather than wanting to engage, and I see the arguments and the discussions that that they're not going to go anywhere. It's two people that are head to head, and they have differences of opinion, and I just don't have the time or desire to get engaged in that. I'd love to have a conversation with somebody and me be educated at the end of it and be better off. I do feel quite uncomfortable with the fact that there's thousands of people now following this page and asking me for my opinion and taking that as gospel, because I don't want people doing that. I'd rather say, this is what I believe and this is why. You go out there, have a look, and you make your own mind up based on what you find. So it's been interesting.
No, I think it's one of my favourite social media pages. So for the listeners, if they're not following your page already, how do they find your stuff?
It's just the Kettlebell Physio on Facebook. That's where I'm generally the most active. I used Instagram as well. If you look for the Kettlebell Physio, you'll find it. The logo is fairly obvious. There's nothing on Instagram that isn't on Facebook. So Facebook's probably the main point of contact.
Fantastic. And I'll put all those details in the show notes as well. So must thank you very much, the Kettlebell Physio, Meigh, for joining us on the 21st Century Physio podcast today. Lots of great knowledge, great tips about for people who are looking to go into business potentially, or maybe already running their business, as well as maybe going and doing some further education and study in the 21st century. So some great tips. Thank you for joining us.
Thanks very much, Steve. Thank you.
Cheers, mate.